Imagine being thousands of feet in the air when the unthinkable happens. The very person keeping the aircraft in control suddenly faces a life or death crisis. Pilot deaths are among the most chilling moments in aviation history, not only because they put their own lives at risk, but because the fate of every passenger rests in their hands. In rare but terrifying cases, real cockpit audio has captured the chaos, panic, and final words of pilots in their last moments. Today, we'll uncover 5 of the most terrifying pilot deaths ever recorded, where the audio still haunts aviation experts and passengers alike. On the morning of February 21, 1970, Swissair Flight 330 took off from Zurich Airport, bound for Tel Aviv, with Hong Kong as its final destination. On board the Convair CV999 Coronado named Baseland were 38 passengers and 9 crew members. It was supposed to be a routine journey. Instead, just 9 minutes after takeoff, horror struck. A bomb hidden deep within the aft cargo compartment exploded, ripping through the aircraft and filling the cockpit with thick, suffocating smoke. The pilots, blinded and struggling to breathe, fought to turn the plane back toward Zurich. Through the haze, they could barely read their instruments. Every second that passed meant less power, less visibility, and less hope. Air traffic control in Zurich tried desperately to guide the aircraft back. The voices captured on the cockpit radio tell a chilling story. Calm professionalism gave way to rising panic as the crew reported compression problems, then fire on board. Their words became fragmented, muffled, almost drowned out by chaos. "We have fire and smoke on board. I can't see anything," one of the pilots cried. Seconds later came their final, heartbreaking message. 330 is crashing. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody. The jet veered west, powerless and off course, before slamming into a wooded area near Wrandlingen, Switzerland. All 47 souls on board were killed instantly. When investigators arrived, wreckage was scattered through the trees, even pieces of fabric hanging from branches like grim reminders of what had just unfolded in the skies above. Sabotage was suspected almost immediately. Just days before, 3 Palestinian militants had been sentenced in Switzerland, and revenge seemed the most likely motive. Reports at the time hinted at responsibility claimed by a Palestinian splinter group, though denials quickly followed. The Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. General Command was named in some accounts, though no one was ever convicted. The bomb itself was a cruel piece of engineering, a barometric-triggered device designed to detonate once the aircraft reached altitude. On that very same day, another bomb exploded aboard an Austrian Airlines Caravelle departing Frankfurt. That plane, unlike Swissair 330, managed to land safely. The cruel efficiency of coordinated terror left the world shaken. In the aftermath, questions piled up. Investigators produced a 165-page report pointing to Palestinian involvement. The Swiss public wondered why no one was ever held accountable. Some, like journalist Marcel Gier, would later claim that Switzerland had struck a secret deal with the PLO, looking the other way in exchange for a promise that no more attacks would target Swiss citizens. Officials denied it, yet suspicions linger to this day. On a freezing January afternoon in 1982, Washington, D.C., the Potomac River below the 14th Street Bridge was coated in jagged sheets of ice. For most people, it was just another miserable winter day. But for the 79 people boarding Air Florida Flight 90, it would become a nightmare that the world would never forget. The flight, a Boeing 737 bound for Fort Lauderdale with a stop in Tampa, was delayed nearly 2 hours. What the passengers didn't know was that the storm wasn't their greatest enemy. The real danger came from inside the cockpit. Captain Larry Wheaton, 34, sat at the controls, with First Officer Roger Pettit, 31, beside him. Both were experienced pilots, but neither had much real-world experience flying in icy conditions like the ones that gripped Washington National Airport that day. They had watched other planes struggle, engines roaring against the frozen ground, wings icing over faster than crews could keep them clear. And yet, despite the clear risks, Flight 90 pushed forward. The plane had already faced problems just leaving the gate. Ice made it impossible for the tug vehicle to push the aircraft back, so the crew tried something desperate, using reverse thrust to free themselves. That decision was against Boeing's recommendations, but it revealed something even more alarming. The crew wasn't following safe winter protocols. They hadn't even switched on the engine anti-ice systems, a safeguard designed specifically for days like this. As the aircraft inched toward the runway, passengers peered out at the snow swirling in the wind. They could see ice clinging stubbornly to the wings, but the crew didn't return for a second round of de-icing. Instead, they tried another risky move, taxiing close behind a DC-9 in hopes its engine heat would melt the snow. What actually happened was far worse. The jet blast melted the snow, which then refroze as an icy layer across the wings and engine inlets. Finally, just before 4 p.m., the plane roared down the runway. Inside the cockpit, Pettit couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that something was wrong. The instruments told them they had enough thrust, but the sound and feel of the engines told a different story. "God, look at that thing," Pettit said nervously. "That don't seem right, does it?" Captain Wheaton brushed him off. Seconds later, the plane lifted clumsily into the air, climbing no higher than a few hundred feet before the stall. Warning blared. The stick shaker rattled violently. "Stalling! We're falling!" Wheaton cried. "Larry, we're going down!" Pettit shouted. "I know," the captain yelled back. Those were his last words. At 4:01 p.m., in less than half a minute of flight, Air Florida Flight 90 slammed into the 14th Street Bridge, crushing cars and trucks caught in the evening traffic. Steel railings twisted like paper, 7 vehicles destroyed, 4 motorists killed instantly. Then, with a deafening roar, the plane plunged straight into the frozen Potomac. In seconds, 78 people were dead or trapped. Only the broken tail remained above the icy water, where a handful of survivors clung desperately. The temperature was just 34 degrees. The river clogged with ice. They had minutes before hypothermia would take them. The crash site was chaos. Traffic jams blocked ambulances from getting through. Rescuers stood helpless on the shore, throwing ropes that fell short while survivors screamed in agony, their bodies slick with jet fuel. When the last survivor was pulled to shore, the silence was deafening. The wreckage of Flight 90 sank slowly beneath the ice, vanishing into the black water as if it had never existed. On the evening of August 12, 1985, Japan Airlines Flight 123 left Tokyo bound for Osaka. There were 524 people on board. Among them were celebrities, parents with children, even the beloved singer Kyu Sakamoto, whose voice had once brought Japan joy with Sukiyaki. No one could have imagined that within an hour, the aircraft would be reduced to twisted metal in the mountains, with only 4 souls surviving. Just 12 minutes after takeoff, cruising above Sagami Bay, the plane shook violently. A deafening explosion tore through the cabin. Passengers screamed as oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. The rear of the plane had literally blown apart, an explosive decompression that ripped off the vertical stabilizer and severed all 4 hydraulic systems. Without hydraulics, the 747 was essentially a drifting coffin. The pilots, Captain Masami Takahama, First Officer Yutaka Sasaki, and Flight Engineer Hiroshi Fukuda, were suddenly fighting the impossible. They yanked at the controls, barked orders, begged the plane to respond, but nothing happened. Their voices, captured forever on the cockpit voice recorder, shifted from calm professionalism to rising desperation. At one point, Takahama muttered words that still chill investigators to this day. "This may be hopeless." For 32 minutes, the aircraft staggered through the skies of Japan, its massive body lurching up and down in phugoid oscillations. From the ground, horrified witnesses looked up to see a Boeing 7TRY-7 rolling and dipping unnaturally, banking at terrifying angles, its tail missing. Inside, passengers clutched loved ones, prayed, and screamed as the plane rose and fell thousands of feet at a time. Some wrote farewell notes to their families on scraps of paper, knowing the end was coming. And still, the pilots fought, desperately trying to use engine thrust to steer the crippled jet, refusing to give up until the very last second. Tokyo air traffic controllers pleaded with the crew to turn back, to head for Haneda or divert to Nagoya, but the 747 barely responded, rolling left and right as if mocking every command. Oxygen masks at the rear had already stopped working. The pilots themselves ignored their own flight engineers' repeated calls to wear their masks, likely disoriented by hypoxia as precious seconds slipped away. Yet, even in this haze, they tried every desperate trick they could imagine, extending the landing gear, manipulating the flaps, begging the engines to give them some measure of control. But the giant machine was simply too broken. At 6:56 p.m., with the ground proximity warning system screaming in the cockpit, the crippled jet clipped a ridge near Mount Takamagahara. The right wing was torn apart. The aircraft rolled, flipped, and then slammed into another ridge. The explosion lit up the forest, and in an instant, 520 lives were gone. The investigation revealed something even more haunting. This catastrophe was not an act of fate, but of human error years in the making. 7 years earlier, the same plane had suffered a tail strike during a landing in Osaka. Boeing technicians had repaired the damage, but incorrectly. Instead of reinforcing the pressure bulkhead with a single continuous plate, they had used 2 smaller plates. This mistake weakened the structure, leaving it vulnerable to fatigue. Every pressurization cycle since then had been ticking time bomb. On Flight 123, it finally gave way. When the truth came out, the horror deepened. The crash was not only the deadliest single aircraft disaster in history, it was also one that could have been prevented. On the morning of August 31st, 1988, passengers boarded Delta Airlines Flight 1141 at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, expecting nothing more than a routine trip to Salt Lake City. The plane, a Boeing 727-200, had already flown in from Mississippi without incident. For many on board, this was just another hop across the country. But within minutes of takeoff, ordinary would collapse into chaos, leaving behind fire, twisted wreckage, and haunting questions that would change aviation forever. At the controls sat Captain Larry Davis, a seasoned pilot with more than 17,000 hours of flight time, alongside First Officer Kerry Kirkland and Flight Engineer Stephen Judd. Behind them, 4 experienced flight attendants prepared the cabin for departure. Everything about the crew and the aircraft looked normal on paper, but in the cockpit, something was happening that passengers could not see, something that would prove fatal. As the engines hummed and the aircraft taxied toward the runway, the crew was not focused on checklists or the intricate demands of takeoff. Instead, their voices captured on the cockpit recorder reveal a chilling truth. They were talking about dating habits, politics, even joking about what they might say if they crashed. A sterile cockpit, required by law during critical phases of flight, simply didn't exist that morning. Discipline had broken down, and with it, the chain of safety meant to protect every soul on board. At 8:30 a.m., the 727 was cleared for takeoff. As the jet accelerated down the runway, nothing seemed amiss. Passengers felt the familiar surge of power, pressing them into their seats. Wheels left the ground. For a brief moment, it seemed like a normal climb. Then, the aircraft lurched violently. The right wing dropped, the tail scraped the runway, and within seconds, the plane began rolling uncontrollably. In the cockpit, Davis pulled back hard, trying to will the jet into the sky. The engines surged, then coughed with compressor stalls as airflow broke down. Witnesses on the ground saw the 727 staggering just a few hundred feet above the runway, trailing fire as it clipped an antenna array. The right wing began to tear apart in midair. The jet slid sideways, struck the ground, and disintegrated into a fiery trail nearly half a mile long. Inside, passengers screamed as flames engulfed the rear of the cabin. Survivors later recalled that the impact itself wasn't what killed most people, it was the fire and smoke. Some managed to fight their way to exits and escape across the burning wreckage. Others, overcome by smoke, never made it out. One man, having escaped the flames, turned back desperately to save his wife and others still trapped inside. He was pulled from the wreckage alive but burned so badly that he died days later in the hospital. When the smoke cleared, 14 people were dead, 2 flight attendants and 12 passengers. Dozens more were badly injured, including the captain and first officer who survived but carried the scars of their mistakes. The investigation revealed the most devastating truth of all. The crash was entirely preventable. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the crash was caused by two failures: the crew's lack of discipline, which led them to skip critical steps, and the malfunction of the takeoff warning system, which should have sounded the alarm. But the finger of blame pointed even higher. Investigators found that Delta's culture allowed sloppy cockpit management, and the FAA had failed to crack down, despite knowing about long-standing issues with discipline among crews. The tragedy of Flight 1141 did more than take lives. The embarrassment of hearing pilots joking on cockpit recordings just before disaster struck shook the entire aviation industry. When the tapes were played on television, the outrage was so severe that laws were changed. Never again would raw cockpit voice recordings be released to the public, only written transcripts. It was the early hours of October 31st, 1979. The Night Owl, Western Airlines Flight 2605, cut through the darkness, gliding south from Los Angeles toward Mexico City. Aboard the massive McDonnell Douglas DC-10 were 88 people, business travelers, families, and crew members who had made the red-eye their routine. The flight left LAX at 1:40 a.m., and by the time it neared Mexico, dawn had not yet broken. Only the faintest traces of twilight hung over the city. Thick fog swallowed the ground below. Visibility was vanishing by the minute. At 5:42 a.m., the DC-10 descended into Mexico City International Airport. On paper, it was a standard approach. The controllers cleared the crew for an ILS approach using runway 23L. But here was the fatal problem. 23L wasn't open. It had been closed since October 19th for resurfacing. Trucks and construction vehicles cluttered its surface. Workers were already out there preparing for another long day. Yet the glide path, the familiar beam of the ILS system, still led straight to that runway. The crew had landed here before while 23L was shut down. They knew the procedure. Use the ILS on 23L, then sidestep visually to the parallel open runway, 23R. But Mexico's controllers never used the phrase sidestep approach, a term American pilots would immediately recognize. Instead, they told the crew 4 different times that their landing runway was 23R. The fog was dense. Twilight made the ground look unfamiliar. And still, the DC-10 stayed locked on course for the wrong strip of asphalt. Inside the cockpit, Captain Charles Gilbert, First Officer Ernst Reichel, and Flight Engineer Daniel Walsh believed they were on final for 23R. But in the last moments, realization crept in. The captain cursed. "No, this is the approach to the goddamned left." A second later, the massive DC-10 smashed down, its left landing gear hitting grass and its right landing gear barely catching the shoulder of 23L. The force of impact was brutal. The plane jolted, bouncing violently. The crew pushed for a go-around. Engines roared, and the jet clawed its way back into the sky. For a fleeting instant, it seemed possible that they might recover. But disaster was already set in motion. The right landing gear tore loose, slamming into the horizontal stabilizer. The crippled jet was now bleeding metal and fire. It rolled sharply to the right. In the cockpit, panic erupted. Reichel shouted desperately, "Get it up!" while Gilbert screamed, struggling to control the wounded aircraft. In just seconds, the DC-10 clipped a dump truck, scattering earth and killing its driver. Moments later, the right wing carved into an excavator, tearing further apart. The roll became uncontrollable. The aircraft spiraled, its wingtip slicing into taxiways. Then, with horrifying force, it slammed into an Eastern Airlines maintenance building north of the runways. Concrete shattered. Fireballs erupted. The DC-10 broke apart in a deafening roar as flames engulfed the wreckage. Debris scattered across the airport and into nearby neighborhoods, where pieces of burning wing ignited houses. Rescue crews rushed to the scene, but chaos made every second impossible. Survivors crawled from a 20-foot section of fuselage that had miraculously stayed intact. They looked back to see the rest of the jet consumed in fire. Some described chunks of the shattered building collapsing onto the wreckage even as they escaped. Others remembered only the screams and the unbearable heat before silence overtook the cabin. Of the 88 souls aboard, 72 never made it out alive. One maintenance worker on the ground died instantly when the aircraft crushed his truck. Dozens more were injured, some scarred forever. Mexico City had just witnessed its deadliest aviation accident, a disaster that shocked both nations and exposed fatal cracks in communication, procedure, and decision-making. The investigation would later blame the pilots for continuing below minimums in near-zero visibility and landing on a closed runway. But pilot unions argued the instructions given were vague, confusing, and dangerously inadequate. Whatever the technicalities, one fact remained. In 26 short seconds from first touchdown to final impact, the night owl had turned into a firestorm. And the most chilling part? This was no isolated event. 1979 was a cursed year for the DC-10. In May, American Airlines Flight 191 exploded into flames at Chicago O'Hare, killing 273. 1 month later, another DC-10 suffered a deadly mishap. Then, only weeks after Flight 2605, Air New Zealand Flight 901 would vanish into Antarctica's Mount Erebus.